I'd like to share with you an adventure I've been on for nearly 5 years now. I've been going to small towns in Appalachia, that region that forms the eastern spine of the United States, stretching all the way from the southern tier of New York down to northern Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi. It's an area that is of unmatched beauty in the eastern United States, yet it's been ravaged by extraction industries of coal and lumber and gas and oil that have sometimes left behind environmental disasters. The people in Appalachia, they have deep roots. Many of them are born there, live there, die there. And they have deep religious roots as well. Economically, the average income in Appalachia is about 19% below the rest of the United States. And the area also trails in terms of education and healthcare. But the people there are wonderful. And what I've been doing is going to small towns in Appalachia, towns of 500 to 2,500 people, and looking for the most positive person in town. When I get there, I interview that person, find out their story. And I want to share some of those stories with you today. I think particularly of Jimmy Stevens, who's the sheriff of Elliott County in eastern Kentucky. Jimmy was working as sheriff and hadn't been paid in 6 months. It was the result of a political row with the county executive. But Jimmy said, I was elected to do this job, and I'm going to do it whether they pay me or not. Jimmy and I talked for about an hour. He was laughing, he was joking, he was smiling. I finally had to ask him, Jimmy, do you ever get upset about things? Do you ever get down? And he said, yeah, I do from time to time. Can you give me an example? He said, well, about 2 weeks ago, we got a call to go out to a house in the hills. There was a house with an above-ground swimming pool, and this beautiful little 2-year-old blonde girl had wandered out onto the deck, fallen into the pool, and drowned. It was the saddest thing I'd ever seen as we lifted her body out of there. I couldn't eat or sleep for 3 days. How did you get over it? He said, well, I got a call from a fellow who needed some help, and I went and helped him. Then there was a woman who needed a hand, and I went and helped her too. By the time I got the third call, I remembered why I was doing this job. You see, one of the things about positive people is that they love to help other folks. I think of another helper, also in law enforcement, and that's Dan McGlaflin, who was in the New York State Police. Now, you may have met a trooper before, and you may not have seen him smile, but Dan McGlaflin was a constant smiler. He said, you know, I spent 30 years in the New York State Police, and I love that job, except for one thing. I hated that black cloud that followed me around. Black cloud? Yeah, it's what my wife calls what happens when I have to go give a notification because of a death from a suicide or an accident. He says, you may not know this, but the typical trooper in the course of a 30-year career has to do it 1 or 2 times, maybe 3 at the outside. In my case, I had to do it 40 times, waking people up in the middle of the night to tell them that they'd lost a loved one. He said, it's tough and it never got easier. He said, I finally retired. I've been retired for 2 or 3 months, and on a Saturday afternoon, I was sitting at home. My feet were up in a recliner. I was watching a baseball game, and a trooper comes to the door, and he says, Mac, I need you to go with me on a notification. He says, no, you don't get it. I'm retired. I don't do that anymore. But you know these people. Did you? He said, yeah, I did. A man and woman who had stood up for my wife and me at our wedding. They were the best man and maid of honor. Their daughter, now a young adult, had died in an outing accident in the Zor Valley, a rugged canyon area in southwest New York. Did you go? I went and I delivered the news. There was a long pause, and he continued. He said, I lost my own daughter at age 17, a head-on with a drunk driver. I got a chill, and I asked him, how in the world as a parent do you ever deal with that? And he said, it's tough. I still go to the cemetery every day. Do you mind if I ask what you do when you're there? He says, no. He says, I talk to her a little bit. I say a prayer. And then I do what I told those other 40 people they needed to do. I get on with my life. You see, it's not the things that happens to us, it's the resilience that we have to bounce back from those things that define us. I think of a woman from Myersdale, Pennsylvania, down near the Maryland-Pennsylvania border. Connie Anderson, who owns Anderson's Florist and Gift Shop. Connie was the youngest of 9 children. She grew up on a dairy farm. When she was only 4, her father died. Now imagine this, her mother there with 9 mouths to feed at a dairy farm. Fortunately, the mom met another man and they married. What's it like to be a man who marries into a family and have instantly 9 children? He must have been something. Well, Connie ended up growing up, marrying a dairy farmer, raised 2 sons, sent them off to college, and then tragedy struck her house. You see, one of her older brothers died of brain cancer. 6 weeks later, her mother was diagnosed with colon cancer. And 2 months after that, Connie's twin sister was diagnosed with leukemia. Connie looked around and said, I've been helping people at church and community and doing all of these things, but I have my own dreams I want to follow. So she went to her husband and said, I'm looking at what's happening in our family. We may not have won the genetic lottery here. I want to open a flower shop. I've been dreaming of that all my life. What do you think? He must have been a great man. He said, do it. If it works, great. If it doesn't, you'll never kick yourself wondering what might have been. What did Connie do? She took what would have been stumbling blocks for most of us and turned them into stepping stones. Again, taking her pain and turning it into a positive future. Perhaps one of the most remarkable people I met is a doctor in Hackleburg, Alabama. He ran a family practice, still does. His name is Dr. Keith Morrow. Hackleburg is in northern Alabama, and on the last Wednesday of April 5 years ago, the forecast for Hackleburg in northern Alabama was really threatening. The forecasters were saying bad tornadoes were coming. It was late in the afternoon when one of Dr. Hackleburg's employees, a nurse practitioner, came to him and said, Doctor, I know you never close the office early, but that sky's looking pretty bad out there. And the radio said, somebody in northern Alabama is going to get hit with a bad tornado. And if we're going to have a tornado, if it's all the same to you, I'd rather be home with my kids than here at work. Would you mind if I left early? He said, you're right, you should go see your family. Then he went to the rest of his staff and said, I just let one of your coworkers go because of the weather. What do you think we should do? They counseled among themselves and decided, yeah, we should close the office. So they closed a half hour early. At the normal closing time, the sky turned black, and a half-mile wide EF5 roared toward Hackleburg. It had winds of 210 miles an hour. The school was totally flattened. A subdivision behind Dr. Morrow's office destroyed. Dr. Morrow's office wiped away. 31 of the 32 businesses in town heavily destroyed or heavily damaged. In that town of 1,500, 18 people lost their lives in a matter of a few minutes. Fortunately, none of Dr. Morrow's staff lived in Hackleburg. They heard about the disaster, and the next morning, they talked their way past the police and National Guard roadblocks to come to work to see what they could save. All they could find was one gurney, everything else gone with the wind. Dr. Morrow looks around and he says, first of all, I want to thank you for being here. I'm glad you're safe and that everybody's okay. Now, this was on Thursday morning. He said, you have a lot of friends and relatives and neighbors and acquaintances who've lost loved ones, who have people in the hospital, who've lost property, or are just plain shaken up. We're not going to get much done here today, so I want you to spend the next 4 days helping them out. Come back on Monday, we'll be open. What? Well, they did that, and they came back on Monday, and he was open. 2 army tents and a camper, and started seeing patients. Dr. Morrow said, some of the folks weren't hurt, but they sure needed a smile from a friendly face and a hug. Dr. Morrow worked out of that makeshift facility, was covered by CNN. CBS Morning News came down. They did a story on it. And Dr. Morrow gets a call from the Pepsi bottler that services his area, says, I think I can help. What if I took one of the vans from an 18-wheeler and made it into an office for you? Great idea, they did it. And what they did was they paneled the inside of it, and they created 3 booths with a bench going through the back and a curtain across the front of each booth, and they were the exam areas. There was a place for a gurney. You walked through a little door near the nose, and you'd found a little spot for a toilet and a refrigerator for things that had to be kept cold. You had to climb up steep steps to get into that trailer. They worked out of that for 6 months while the office was being rebuilt. If somebody was too infirmed or too old to get up the steps, Dr. Morrow went and did the consultation in his car. He actually took a half hour out of the middle of his day when I showed up at his office unannounced to tell me the story. Any surprise that he was named the U.S. Country Doctor of the Year? Wouldn't it be amazing to have a doctor like that? I think of a woman who lives in Shanksville, Pennsylvania. She was a widow in her 60s, and she decided that she wanted to go into the ministry. She was assigned to a church in Shanksville. September 11th, 2001, her life changed when less than 2 miles away, United Flight 93 went down. Guess what? Her church was the closest public building to that impact site. It was immediately turned into an area for the local people to give service, refreshments to all the first responders. And later, when the investigators came, again, they supported. That day, Sylvia Baker, the pastor, was interviewed by media from around the world 50 to 60 times. BBC television was in her living room interviewing her. Who could expect to go into a life like that and have that kind of a day? Well, things have calmed down in Shanksville, and she's taken up exercising. She now runs. She enters 5K and 10K races. She's 82 years old. And she says to me, guess what? I win a ribbon or a medal almost every time. And then she laughs and says, of course, I'm the only one in my age group. But last year I did beat a woman from Pittsburgh. There's another person I want to share with you. He was a soldier in World War II. His name is Doug Brown. He lives in Franklin, West Virginia. He was only 21 when he went overseas. He had signed up with a group from Bedford, Virginia. The group from Bedford trained together. They went to England together. And on June 6, 1944, they all went ashore together on D-Day in the second wave at Omaha Beach. The boys from Bedford, as they were known, suffered heavy casualties. There were 46 of them who went ashore. Only 23 came home from the war. Doug, a very religious man, said, I was sure I was going to die. But I made a deal with God. I promised him if I lived, I would spend the rest of my life helping people. He laughs as he says, God must have a sense of humor. He's maybe lived to be 91, and I'm still here helping people. He was wounded 3 times, won other awards, but he's come back, and he's a model for other people. Basically, the lesson is this. It's not the bad things that happen to us in our lives that are important, but rather it's how we respond. We get to choose the way that we can be our best selves. I would suspect that these people aren't just in Appalachia. They're all around us. They're in our neighborhoods. They're in our school. They're in our families. And I suspect that if we took the time, we could hear their stories. So I'm going to end with 2 challenges for you. The first challenge, is it possible for you to go out and find other positive people in your lives? To sit down and deeply listen to their stories and understand what makes them tick so that maybe you could learn to be like them. And secondly, a bigger challenge. Is it possible? Is it slightly possible that you too could be a better person, a more positive person for those around you? I want you to think about that. Thank you.